Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, it is the 22nd of November, 2022. Um, I think the last one of these that I recorded might have been like a day or two ago. I have a problem with my perception of time. Like everything seems contemporaneous. Uh, I remember when I was in middle school, a week seemed like forever. And now I blink and semester has gone by or a year has gone by. It's frightening. But I feel vaguely like the last one I recorded was on the 19th because I remember saying that, although my memory is not, the fidelity is not what it once was. It was nonetheless relatively recent, and I went for a stint without recording too many of these. Uh, Thanksgiving is coming up at the end of the week, and bizarrely, my schedule is empty on Thursday and Friday. Thursday is, to be fair, meant to be our no meeting day, normally, but this past Thursday it was just back-to-back meetings, and it's just been like ratcheting up every week. For a little while, I was maintaining it, and then we had more and more, and we have a pretty big contract that was coming up, so we kind of had, to be fair, had to do something. Or it was it was pressing, but it was getting annoying, and it's nice to see a Thursday without meetings. But this week, for a variety of reasons, my schedule is pretty light, and because Thanksgiving is coming up, and then for a number of other reasons, but because of that, I kind of thought I wanted to talk a little bit about gratitude. That's today's word, gratitude. And it, the reason this came up was a couple days ago. I saw somebody in their Instagram story. Instagram is the new Twitter for me, by the way. It's not, but it's like where I'm spending a lot of time. I saw somebody in their Instagram story, and I don't remember the details of it, but basically she had some shitty stuff happen when she was a kid. She had shitty stuff happening to her now, and she was expressing that she's grateful for, some things that were not shitty. And I was just thinking, like, we have this weird, I almost want to call it a hang up, but I don't even know what the right word would be. We have this strange, just perverse idea in our culture that you should always be kind of grateful for things. And to be fair, I'm grateful for a lot of things. There are lots of good things, and no matter where you are, I've talked about this a lot, but I do believe that the human mind has a certain sort of spectrum, certain range of experiences. And it's calibrated based on what your experiences are, what your life is. And so if your life is really shitty, your range is calibrated to that shittiness. And things, are sort of scaled accordingly. And if your life is really good, like if you're some kind of rich, snot-nosed kid and you've had a privileged life, then not getting something that you want immediately seems really shitty to you. And I'm not trying to say that all of these things are equally valid, because obviously, like if you're starving to death, or your kid is dying, or your kid is going blind because of malnutrition, that's a little bit different than the pharma boy not being able to get to keep his little Wu-Tang album or something like that. I definitely am cognizant of that, and I don't want to. I would really not want to sort of suggest that there's any kind of equivalence there. But that being said, I do think it's kind of important to understand that even if our lives are much easier and kind of good relative to most people's, we're allowed to have ups and downs. It's kind of the nature of human life. And to deny yourself that, I think, you do have to sort of check yourself and understand, like, yes, my problems are definitely definitely not as big of a deal as this person's. But my ups are also not as big of a deal as this person's. And no matter where you are, there's always kind of a range that things could be much worse, they could be much better. Yeah, you have to understand that. And in that context, I think it's implied at a certain, you should be aware, but it should also be implied that, like, yes, I know things are not that bad relative to a lot of people. I think about this a lot when I'm complaining about having days full of meetings, because there are people who work on a fucking hot roof and lift heavy shit all day, every day, and they don't get a break, and they have really shitty jobs that are genuinely physically hard and demanding and damaging. And I'm complaining that I have to talk to people on Zoom for a few hours a day. Yeah, sounds pretty fucking stupid, frankly. But nonetheless, it is frustrating and annoying. So I think we can keep these two ideas in our minds. At the same time, we can understand where things actually lie on the sort of abstract, broad spectrum of experiences. And we can still understand that, yeah, it's still annoying to have a day full of meetings. Or whatever it was that this woman was kind of half complaining about, but also beating herself up for complaining about. And whatever it was, she had things that were worse than things that I would generally have. I am grateful, I mentioned this a lot, but I am grateful for a lot of things, obviously. Like, I'm so grateful, I've said this many times, for having been raised without religion. I know so many people who, even if they become non-religious, like they have an awakening and they kind of leave religion behind them, they still have this kind of, air quotes, spirituality. And they still frame, I feel like when the paint is wet, when the cement is still not set in your brain, if you shape it with religion, then when it sets, even if you leave it, you think about the world in a sort of weird supernatural way. Everything is kind of in that framework. I think it is possible to leave it, but you have that, I don't think epistemology is the right word, although that is a part of it, but it's sort of the basis set of concepts that you formulate the world in. And it's very hard for people to go like, yeah, that's just all silly, and yeah, kind of leave it. Whereas if you're not raised with it, then it just seems fucking insane. I mean, it seems pretty absurd. And especially, like, if it wasn't so destructive, it would just seem silly and absurd, but it's also so destructive. And people, I've this is another thing. I should just not say this is a thing that I've said many times, because it's just common. Just assume. But people will sit there and they'll sort of, I don't know, they'll take their sort of worldview and then start saying, I don't know, they'll conceive of I don't really have a good, it's funny, I have the concept in my mind and I can't vocalize it. It's really frustrating. It's actually really annoying. It's actually to the point where I almost want to edit this part out, because it's just my brain having a complete, like, fell off the rails moment. I will come back to this in a second. I'm going to go way, way off topic for a second, and then I'll come back. Because Thanksgiving is coming up. When I was a kid, I was a weird kid. I used to watch there was like a public access channel on cable, and they would have college lectures. I'd watch that. And I liked PBS, which at the time was not like, was not as poorly funded and was not deeply in the pockets of the Kochs and all of this. And I would watch the McLaughlin Group. And every year, John McLaughlin at the end of the show would go, gobble gobble for Thanksgiving. And it's just somehow popped into my mind before starting this. It's I do think that our brains, to some extent, even when we think we're being original, they're really kind of just remixing a bunch of bullshit that kind of comes in through the course of our lives, and especially probably our childhoods. But you get that stuff, and then you kind of barf it out in different ways. And I mean, this is like, I'm working on Japanese. And one of the things that when I was taking French as a kid, I sat there and we had to do these sort of scenarios, like little plays. And it always felt stupid to me. And I was like, oh, I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't like it. In retrospect, knowing a little bit more, those scenarios are really giving you like little chunks of conversation, little chunks of everyday kinds of experiences. And they could just be introducing yourself, saying good morning, saying good night, saying how things were, ordering coffee, just little snippets of conversations. And once you have those, I think the way that our brains work, we kind of grab those little chunks, and to be fair, we are like combining them. There's some, I don't want to necessarily say originality, but there's some agency to us putting them together. Like that stringing together of the little bits that we're snipping. There, you could put something there and say that it's not just completely rehashing shit that came in. It's not just the garbage that went in is coming out. Although even there, you put two people in the same scenario, and then sometimes you'll have the same conversation. Or I go get coffee every morning, and sometimes we'll have very interesting conversations that wind off in some totally different direction. But sometimes the conversation I have with the barista, it could be the same exact conversation we've had like 1,500 other times. And it's not that we're reciting lines per se. It's just that you get in that scenario and these are the things you say, and then these are the responses that you have. And things do bifurcate, and there are different channels that you can follow. But quite often, shockingly often, those channels are not that diverse, really. And there are things that there are like extremely low probability things that could happen at any moment, but they're probably not going to. Yeah, I could just do that. And the odds of that happening at any moment, like it's something I could do anytime, but you can guess that I'm probably not going to do it almost all of the time. And the only reason I did it there was because contextually it kind of made some sense. And so I think this is it relates, it's probably obvious why that relates to the religion thing, but I think when you have it's not just what we're saying, it's the ideas that we're thinking about are sort of rehashes of other ideas that we've been exposed to. And this is one area where I think, there are people, if you look at Nobel Prize winners or people who've made big contributions to science or philosophy, there are a lot of people who make like one big contribution and they have like one little realization. Often that person, even if they're prolific later on, they'll do different versions of the same thing. It's like, well, I took this thing that they use in solid state physics and applied it to biophysics, and this is what it told me, which is new and interesting, and people hadn't thought about it before. And then they have another paper that's, oh, well, I did something that's either rhymes with that or expands on it, or, and even if they kind of diverge a little bit from that, you feel the theme, right? And I hate going back to Einstein so much, but when you really have someone who is like that magnitude of a genius, the difference between somebody who just has a tiny little realization and then rehashes that, or makes things that are kind of naturally branched from it. This is someone who takes something and then looks at it in a different way and comes up with Brownian motion and statistics on that, and then takes something else and comes up with like special relativity. Or, the interesting thing is, of course, it's not like special relativity just like poofed out of nowhere. There were bits and pieces there already. I think Minkowski space kind of came before it, and then you kind of make some realizations and you put some stuff together. I could be wrong on the order, but there was certainly some stuff coming in advance. Certainly like general relativity, Riemann and Ricci and all of these other people did differentiable manifolds and differential topology, and there were a bunch of things that went into these concepts. And certainly like metric spaces, which have measures that can be 0 or negative, are things that existed before. So it's, even then, you're kind of taking things and then reapplying them. But the genius is sort of taking things and kind of making your own little extra drop or extra realization. Now, I guess, is it, you always go kind of to the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. There was a little stuttering there. It was a little weird. The Hardy-Weinberg thing, I never remember which one was which, but there was a biologist and a mathematician. I've told this story before, so I'll give you the short version. And the biologist was talking to the mathematician at lunch. And this is, the story's probably apocryphal, but this basically probably like the broad strokes are not totally, there at least is a toy model, something you can think of. Biologist is like, we can't understand how this evolution thing works, and how this distribution of a simple gene with 2 alleles, dominant and recessive, like how do these work in populations? And the mathematician looks at this and he's like, and it was like a massive problem in biology, they just didn't know it. Mathematician, because they're trained in math, I was like, that's just the quadratic equation. A squared plus 2ab plus b squared equals. And it's one of these things where, equals 1. It's one of these things where you're like, if you had a comprehensive understanding of, and that biology thing actually, you'll notice is the same thing. This was my very thinly veiled version of my PhD advisor. He took some solid state normal mode kind of physics, so like linear oscillators, things are at a certain distance and then they have frequencies based on that, and then they're architected in some kind of topology, and then you have resonances and movements based on the shapes and the lengths and the constraints. And he applied that to biology, and this was a big thing. It pretty much made his career, at least his later life career. Became a professor at ASU, got a decent amount of money. He's currently, I think, an emeritus professor at ASU. And this is all based on this thing, which in reality, if you knew these two things, would be kind of like that quadratic equation thing. But people in biophysics didn't know this stuff, and so it was a real novelty. It makes you think, like, if you had an encyclopedic knowledge of everything that people know, how many connections would you make? How many realizations would you make? And they would seem, I mean, this is, if you think about superintelligence, obviously you have like speed superintelligence is like a person that's just thinking really fast. And you have the ability to think at a higher level. But simply having more memory and having the ability to assimilate all, like the mass sum of human knowledge, and then make those connections, that alone would probably yield so many realizations that are obvious. Like they're not even things that really are. You wouldn't call them genius. They're just like there. They're just dots waiting to be connected. And people eventually would probably figure it out, But a machine that could understand all of that stuff and synthesize it in that way would be able to make just massive realizations pretty quickly. It's one of these things where, fortunately, not too many people are watching this. But you think like if somebody had that realization, it might be an interesting thing to mine. And it would probably be something that could be quite powerful and maybe even a little bit dangerous. Like, it's one of those things where actually, now that I'm saying it, I'm kind of like wondering, do you want to put that out there? Because you put that out there and like probably nothing comes of it, but not that it's like this massive thing. Obviously, anyone thinking about this could realize this, but it's an interesting thing to me. And similarly, like going back to this religion thing, if you're a normal human, you live a normal human life, you have sort of your sphere of understanding and experiences, and you kind of, you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You think about things in certain ways, you have these little fragments of conversation, and that's just sort of what you talk about. It's one of the reasons why people who are well-read start throwing in different things and start sounding more intelligent, because they've got other people's words coming out of their mouth. Which, and to be fair also, it's like you learn, oh, you could do this construction and you can remix those constructions and so on. But it does kind of make you think. I'm not saying it's like a cheat, but it's a little bit of a cheat relative to being someone who was genuinely able to come up with stuff completely de novo, which probably is not really a thing. Like, even I'm not sufficiently literate to be able to come up with lots of people, but Shakespeare kind of comes to mind, where you have somebody who was very prolific and also came up with all sorts of little linguistic constructions and jeu de mots, little wordplay things that just have endured for so long because they're clever and they're funny and they're poignant and they're little things that have added to our language that often we'll even use without knowing, or we'll use something that's maybe derived several generations of copy and variation, and then copying that and varying it, and they've come to us in that way. And it's interesting to me that you have this kind of thing. But even that kind of person, they're still stuck to some extent within the framework that they have. It's an interesting thing. There's a whole field of, I don't know if it's a field, there's a whole chunk of research wondering, like, who was Shakespeare actually, or was it a pen name? And it's kind of weird that this one person who wasn't that well educated had all of these concepts and ideas that kind of came from, if you were sufficiently literate and knowledgeable at that time, you might have known them. But and people think about this, and you kind of think like, I have no opinion here other than just to comment on it. It seems like probably nothing there, but it's not that hard to imagine for me, somebody who was just a little bit extra literate and a little bit kind of paid attention and listened to people absorbing some of that stuff and synthesizing it. But you could also imagine someone who is just using a pen name or a group of people. But I would refer you to other people there, because I obviously don't have enough of the knowledge and background there to really go into the meat of that. But getting back to gratitude and the things that the reason I really wanted to talk about it, other than this Instagram thing, this is going to sound really weird, and it's going to come back to Twitter. How does that happen? Elon Musk is doing some really stupid shit on Twitter, and one of the things that I'm a little bit grateful for, and I think, I am very upset about losing Twitter. Like, and to be fair, this is a this is a thing that I'm imposing on myself. It's not really making a big impact. It's not like my lack of presence on Twitter is really, shaking the walls there. It's self-imposed. It's really just, kind of silly. It's like, well, I never feel like not going to Chick-fil-A is hurting me, but it's not like it's helping that much. But although I definitely encourage you not to be on Twitter and don't go to fucking Chick-fil-A because they're bigoted assholes. They're very nice people. This is the funny thing. They're like, oh, they're so, like the Southerners who are going to go, bless your heart. Doesn't that sound lovely? It just means fuck you, but bless your heart. It just sounds so nice. And I would rather have somebody say fuck you to your face than be super sickeningly sweet, and then be like twisting the knife to your face, but behind your back, and you don't even realize it. Like if you didn't know what bless your heart meant, you would just think it was like a positive thing almost. You might think about it later and like, but it doesn't sound bad. It sounds kind of nice. And anyway, Elon Musk, I have to say, I think for a lot of reasons, obviously we're not really a meritocracy. And I don't think his engineering prowess is very great. In fact, I watched, again on Instagram, so it's annoying. There was this interview, I think it was on the Daily Beast's Instagram, but wherever it was Patton Oswalt. And he's talking about Elon Musk. And he started with the whole thing like Mush said comedy is legal now on Twitter. And he's like, okay. So now this is game on for the comedians. And he's explaining sort of like everybody thinks that they're funny. A lot of people think they're entitled to be funny. And he's just not. And it's kind of sad how much the dude wants to be funny. I mean, he's on Saturday Night Live, and I'm not a doctor. I've not seen him. I can't. But the whole concept that he has Asperger's, I don't think he has Asperger's. I think he's just an asshole, And it's not to say that lots of people actually genuinely do. Maybe he does. But I think he's just a fucking idiot and not very funny. And kind of, I don't think that he's socially awkward in the sense that he doesn't have the capacity for it. I think he's just an ass. And he's a shithead. And, you notice that I am saying these things are properties of him and not like you're behaving like a shithead. I'm saying he is a shithead. And I normally try to not do that, but I do think he's kind of a shithead. And maybe there's some kind of clinical reason for it, but I don't think so. I don't fucking think so. And it kind of annoys me, actually, that, like you're sort of claiming this thing that is a genuine thing that and not that it's just an affliction, but a lot of people actually have it and they have to deal with it and they have to live their lives figuring out how to navigate with this thing that's genuinely changing their perception or making certain kinds of things difficult for them. And you're just an asshole. And it's not cool. It's not cool. He's also a privileged motherfucker. I mean, his dad's emerald mine, and you think like, okay, if he would have failed, air quotes failed, he would have been fine. And I can't help but think about this because with my co-founder, I discovered, and this is one of the reasons that I have a light week, discovered that we're not getting paid. Didn't get paid this past Friday, which would have been payday. And we'll make it up, I'm sure, but things were a little bit light, and some things that were and still are coming in didn't come in yet, and you kind of just don't have enough money at a certain point, and we're not getting paid. I thought we were past that, but that's where we are. But you think about, like, if Musk would have found himself in a position, it's interesting to think about what Peter Thiel's background is. I need to look into that because I suspect I would be shocked if he was genuinely, air quotes, self-made and didn't have some kind of leg up. But Elon Musk, you go out and you gamble on some startups and you fire a bunch of people and you do all kinds of shitty stuff and you're still okay, right? Versus my co-founder and we actually are relatively privileged compared to a lot of people. Like, there are plenty of people who could not have done the stuff that we've done, and they certainly couldn't have like a dozen people on the payroll, and growing, and not like decently paid. Not maybe like the top of the market, but decently paid people who are good and well qualified, making their lives based on something that we made. I feel good about that. I feel some gratitude about it. But I also feel a little bit fucking bitter to know, like, Jeff Bezos, things get a little thin, you have like some off months, and then you just ask dad, go to the bank of dad, get a check for 250 grand. Or Trump getting millions and millions and millions of dollars from his dad. I don't envy these people, to be clear. I don't think they had, like, I'm very grateful my parents were not shitheads like Trump's parents or Musk's parents or Bezos's parents. Probably, I don't know enough about him to know, but I bet that they were not great people. Very grateful my parents are who they were. But it is annoying when you think, oh, well, if we had a different background, these bumps would not even be a big deal. You just kind of weather them, and then with confidence I can say, you go through those things, and as long as you can keep going, things will get better, and we will continue to grow, and things will eventually be actually doing pretty well. And it's annoying to know that, and to know, like, things are difficult for us, and other people will just get to that kind of situation and they have no choice but to quit. Because if you have a kid, or you have people who are dependent on you, or you're most normal people, you don't have a sister who's a doctor who can help you out, or in my co-founder's case, siblings who have some money and can help you out, and all of these other things. If you don't have that stuff and you're trying to start a business, you're basically fucked. It's one of the reasons why, and I think about where I stand politically a lot. Probably would call myself a democratic socialist. Not exactly sure where I fit, but someplace pretty left. Not into the communism realm, but although I do like, if we were like at the point where we had full automation and could have like Star Trek level sort of, what do they call it, luxury space communism, I'd be into that. I think that's kind of nice. I find that appealing. The current structure where you actually have people having to do the jobs, I'm not sure about that. And I've seen know enough about history to know that that's not worked out so well when people have tried it. And I don't think it's that people have never really tried it. It's the same thing. Bizarrely, it's the same thing with people who think like, oh, if markets were really free, we've just never really tried to have a truly free market, but if they were, it would just magically work. Both of these groups are on, and I hate to, it's not like a horseshoe theory where they're similar in, they have very different concepts and very different ideas, but the disconnect from reality and the sort of toy model, just getting enamored with this very simplistic idea that, oh, the world works this way and this is just a magical panacea for everything. When all evidence shows, not really. Yeah, it's not worked out so well when people have tried this. And, generally speaking, I know more about the history of communism than this one, but I do know that both have been attempted pretty well. And I think people who are very sincere have tried to implement them. And what ends up happening is reality crashes into that. And then it turns out there's a reason that you have federal agencies and regulations and all of this kind of stuff. Or it turns out there are reasons why you have certain market forces that kind of work. And you have simply trying to do state planning doesn't really work. And there are things, there are things that are nice about this kind of stuff. And I'm somebody who has, I have a couple of businesses. If I can say that, I mean, it's not like only one of them makes money and that one is very much stretched, but at least at the moment. But yeah, so I'm not like way out there, but I'm pretty far out there. And I think like one of the reasons why I do think everyone has the right, everybody deserves, frankly, food and shelter, and not just like the minimal, okay, you can have shelter, but you're going to be in a little barrack and it's going to be shitty, or like a capsule hotel kind of thing. No, I think, and we have the capacity for this. Everybody deserves to have a decent space. Like, if you want to be an artist and you don't want to make money, you should be able to just paint. And you should be able to get paints and get canvases or get the clay. And then, and I'm not necessarily saying everybody has like millions of dollars worth of hardware at their place until we get to the luxury space communism level. But, you should be able to have like a lot of that stuff. Everybody should have, in the modern world, everybody should have a computer and high-speed internet access, and not like a shitty computer from the 80s. I mean, you should have a decent, performant computer. I would like to say a Mac, but something nice. And you should be able to have heating and air conditioning and a fridge and a stove and all these kinds of things. And that should just be the baseline. And one of the reasons I feel so strongly about this, aside from the fact that I think we live in a very wealthy society with the resources to do this, and there are lots of people who just can't work, and there are lots of people who frankly aren't, like, life is not work. There are other things that matter more. But as somebody who kind of has an interest in doing stuff, and I mean, the company that I have that's making money doesn't do the exact things that I'd like, but slowly inching toward it. Maybe eventually in time I can see a path to getting there. And certainly if I didn't have to worry about making rent, and I didn't have to worry about healthcare, it was just there. Like, everybody should have free universal healthcare, and I didn't have to worry about a bunch of other shit. I didn't have to worry about having hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loans. That, I'm grateful that they just pushed it back another 6 months. But I gotta tell you, at a certain point, they're not gonna push them back anymore. Well, I mean, I guess it's not necessary, but pushing it back 6 months just delays the inevitable. And I'm very glad that it is pushed back. I'd much rather that than not. But I'm going to blink and it's going to be 6 months from now. And once again, you find yourself in the same fucking situation where it's like these things, and I'm very grateful to have a PhD and to have a master's and my couple of undergrad degrees and to have had that experience. And I think everybody should have that stuff. And I also think those things should not be, like, the reason that you go to school, it does help you in work. I know a lot of people who don't think so, but it does help you. It really does. And those experiences, no matter how far they seem from whatever you're doing, I've never learned something that I never found useful someplace else down the road. And often many things have many uses. And sometimes they're esoteric things and you don't realize it at the time. Like, this doesn't seem, the classical example is always Jobs and the typography class that he sort of sat in that led to WYSIWYG eventually. But there are lots of things like that. And certainly also, and I think the world shows how essential this one is, learning about ethics, learning about just the philosophy of law, learning about the philosophy of government, learning about why things run certain ways. Why is it that when you try to, if you're like what do those people call themselves? The objectivists. If you're an objectivist and you're like super into unrestricted free market and all that kind of stuff, why do you end up eventually still recreating regulations? And if they're not federal agencies, essentially the same thing. There are reasons for these things, and understanding them, it helps. It's one of the reasons why people who, my ex-wife had an undergrad philosophy degree, and they just laugh at the, like, people with more than like philosophy 101 look at objectivists and they just like, what the fuck is wrong with these people? They're so dumb. Not to be crap. I mean, you know, it's not that you're like mentally incapable of doing more, but ignorant is maybe the better one. Like, if you, Ayn Rand's shit is just bad writing that if you read The Republic, this is the thing that always struck me. I've not been able to read more than a few pages of her shit because it's so bad and so dumb. But I've read it. I've read little excerpts and bits of it. And the thing that was shocking was, like, people are enamored with it and they think this is brilliant. And then you look at it and it's like, this is the fucking Republic. I don't mean it's the same kind of content as the Republic, but I mean basically she seems to have read the Republic and then thought like, oh, I'm just going to do the same thing. And then you look at, what is it, the Fountainhead, I think is the one, her big stupid thing. And all it is, as far as, granted, small excerpts, but I'm pretty fucking sure the whole thing is like this. I gather all it is just her words coming through the mouthpieces of the characters in there. Which, you know, at the time that Plato wrote The Republic, it was a really big original concept probably, and people didn't think about doing it that way before. But in the 21st century, or the 20th century, I guess at the time, we've gotten past that. Like, we've thought about some things beyond that. There's a little bit better ways to do stuff. And you just see this and you're like, how do you people not know? It's why people fall in love with this shit in high school, and it's why when you have an adult like Paul Ryan, who is supposed to be the Republican brain trust and is super into this shit, you think, this guy must know fucking nothing. Like, how just ignorant do these people have to be? And anyway, rolling back. So Patton Oswalt was explaining, you know, like, well, he didn't say Musk was a rocket scientist, to be fair, but he said, you know, like, I'm not a rocket scientist. And it's just like, not being good at comedy is just not having a skill. That, you know, if you're not a good flautist, then we don't look down on you. It just means you don't have that skill. He was explaining. And the thing that I wanted to add to this, and I actually did in the comment and when I shared it, was just that Musk is not a rocket scientist. He has a lot of good engineers working for him, and some shitty engineers, and an increasing number, as far as I understand, at Tesla at least, of shitty engineers who just are like, you know, disciples of him. But he's not a good engineer himself. And he sits there and says these things and sounds like he knows what he's talking about. But for the most part, he's just regurgitating shit that good engineers have told him. And you can kind of gather that, but a lot of people don't have enough. The thing is, like, with comedy, it's pretty obvious. Most people, even if you're not a comedian, you can tell from funny. You know, you can have some kind of idea, like, oh, this guy's just not very funny. He's kind of cringy. And, you know, if somebody's talking about fucking, like, neural networks or autonomy or control theory or rocket surgery, you know, it's for the most part, people don't have the qualification and the background to understand or to really gauge that stuff, to grade it. You can't say, like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about because he's sitting there going, oh, it sounds like he knows what he's talking about. But you can really hear it when you do know that stuff, that he doesn't have a very, like, there's not a lot of depth there. And it really is just regurgitating shit that he's heard. I'm 100% sure of that. One reason you can guess this is when he got high and made the white paper on the fucking vacuum train. What does he call that? What is his Segway called? I can't even think of what it's called. The giant thing that's like 100-year-old vacuum train that was supposed to be like this revolutionary thing that obviously, but you look at that and all of the stuff in there, the Hyperloop, that's what he called it. That stupid fucking thing, it just, if he actually had any knowledge or understanding of these things, he would have realized all of the problems that are involved in this concept. And one of the reasons, or all of the reasons really, why we don't do that. Like it's not like coming up with a vacuum train or a low pressure tube is something that people couldn't do. I mean, there were pneumatic trains at one point in time, a long time ago. That was a thing that people did. It wasn't the same concept, but like basically the pneumatic tube that they used to use at banks. I think they still use them at banks, but to like put people in a little thing and just flunk them down. There are things that there are reasons, like having a hard vacuum on a long track and having the requirement. I mean, just if something is actually moving fast in a tube and you try to turn very quickly, I mean, just fucking physics 101, you're going a certain speed and you're turning, which means you're accelerating, centripetal force and all this kind of stuff. And it has a lot of consequences. Like if you tried to build this thing, I don't even want to never mind. I don't want to get into all the reasons why but suffice it to say, there are lots of clues. Like it's not a shock that he's not that brilliant, and it's not a shock that he doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. And it's also not a shock that, like you see him sitting there on Twitter and doing shit that's just dumb. Like just fucking, and I'm sorry for, I'm not trying to use ableist language here, but it's just, the stuff that he's doing is not well thought out. It shows a deep lack of understanding of human nature and of consequences of doing something. I always just think, the famous thing is you give a teenage kid a fucking Lamborghini. Give them the keys to the Lamborghini. Super rich parents. And kind of irresponsible parents. They give them that. And, if you give them the keys to a Toyota, Toyota's a great car. But Toyota is not a car where if you do the wrong things, you can flip it up into a tree. Lamborghini, you can flip into a tree if you don't. And it's just like there's so much power there. And if you know what you're doing, then you can do amazing things with it. But if you don't know what you're doing, then you can launch the fucking thing into a tree. And this is Musk with Twitter. He's got so much net worth and so many things that he can do and so many resources and so many people just sucking him off. And you see him there. And the one thing that I'm grateful for there is you can see, right? It's a little obvious that he doesn't know what he's doing. And the things that should have been obvious to everybody long ago kind of are coming out a little bit. And I hope that the consequence there is going to be that as he runs Twitter into the ground, which I assume that he's going to do, as he launches it out into a tree, people will take note and they'll start realizing, like, maybe if the emperor doesn't have clothes here, he also doesn't have clothes over here. It's not hard to make that cognitive leap. It's like, oh, he actually is not that good of an engineer. He's not a rocket scientist. He's, just an idiot with too much money who has read a bunch of old science fiction. And it's depressing to me, honestly, like how cool SpaceX and some of the stuff that they're doing is juxtaposed with how just awful and shitty he is as a human being. And also, like in terms of engineering, like it's lucky, I guess, that he's got some of the right directions there. Although also, I don't know. I mean, you look at Blue Origin, and they're doing things in a much more traditional way. Um, I don't know. I don't know what's going to come out with the New Glenn and all this kind of stuff. But like maybe it won't work. Maybe they're going to do a bunch of stuff, invest a bunch of money, and it's not going to go anywhere. I kind of suspect that what's going to happen though is they're going to have a rocket one day and it'll just kind of work. And it'll be like, oh, yeah. And you have all these Musk fans who are sitting there making fun of Blue Origin because they're not welding together steel and like doing all this stuff. And I'm convinced Starship is going to work. I do think, kind of unfortunately, he's got like a formula there that could work. But the Musk people who think that that's like the way to go, there are reasons that rocket science is the way it is. And it's not like, it's the same thing actually, I guess, with the objectivists and the people who are like super into communism that are just like detached from reality. It's not like you're just putting together, some kind of hobby thing. And you can, in principle, do some of this stuff, but you really have to do a lot of hard engineering. And it also, I mean, the reason that it's working is that as much as it looks like they're just like slapping shit together, engineers are doing a lot of work in the background to make these things work. And the stuff that you're seeing is kind of, that seems a little bit slapdash. To some extent it was at the beginning, but a lot of it is kind of just the facade. And then you get, and I like Tim Dodd, but you get people like Tim Dodd going out, and I swear, I would bet if you actually put Tim Dodd, and I don't know why I'm picking on him, but I've seen an interview with him, of him by Elon, no, an interview of Elon Musk by him. And you see this, and I suspect that and I'm not saying that he's an amazing person or that he's got, like a lot of background, but I think he's trained himself on these topics to such an extent that he probably knows more than Musk does about them. And you almost see like the cracks where he almost makes the realization, but I think he's just got this, it's a problem. You have these people that kind of get so enamored with him. And once you go down that path, once you're framing the world in that way, it's very difficult to see things from a different perspective. You've decided things are a certain way, and you were raised thinking there's like this weird magical force in the universe, and that words are gonna make things, manifest things, and all this kind of bullshit. And then the next thing you know, you're an adult, and yeah, you're not religious, but you believe in, what is it? I can't even think of what it's called, tarot cards and astrology and all this kind of stuff. It's like, it's an interesting thing that the people that are really heavily into this shit are a lot, not all of them, I'm not making like an overly generalized kind of thing here, but a lot of them are people who were raised with a little bit of religion and then kind of stepped away from it. But they have that framework of magical thinking. And I think once you think about the world in that way, and once you sort of think, oh, this is just how the world is put together, even if you take away the details of that religion, now you've still got those sort of mystical, kind of magical things happening. And you kind of, you see that it's not even it's not a crooked path. It's like a straight, direct path from A to B. And similarly, people who think that Musk is a genius, even the ones that are equipped, it's kind of depressing, honestly, but the ones that are equipped to recognize him for what he is, they get there and they're also smart enough to be able to misinterpret or take the stuff that he says that's kind of silly and is like, that's wrong, and either think, oh, I just don't understand it, or twist whatever he says into something that seems more informed or more thoughtful or whatever. And also, I mean, this is a con man thing. This is like a cold reading kind of technique. But, he's sitting there with the engineers, and there are ways to be ignorant and to react to questions that make it not obvious that you don't know the answers. This was a thing that I was thinking. I've thought about this a lot, actually, and I'm gonna take off in a minute, but I've thought about this a lot with fundraising. I do think you see like these Adam Newman, Theranos kind of Elizabeth Holmes people. They raise a lot of money and there's not much there. And I really think that they're just kind of bullshit artists. And part of it is just being shameless, but part of it is also they have techniques down where they can just sort of convince people that they know things they don't know, and convince people things are going to work that aren't going to work, or that they understand, they have some kind of deeper insights and understanding into things. And I think similarly, I'm not saying I could have done this, but when I took the oral exam for my instrument rating, I am completely certain that if I was a little bit better at bullshitting and willing to do it, I could have bullshitted my way through it. And I pretty much didn't deliberately, because I was like, I do think if I had a different DPE, I probably would have been waved by. But I think it's kind of good to have a deeper knowledge and understanding of some of the things that I was a little bit weak on, like some of the weather stuff. I just need to study a little bit more and need to get some direct practice. I'm a little bit annoyed. This is not a thing against either one of my flight instructors, but both for my private pilot and for my instrument, both of those flight instructors did a little bit of, well, the private did a lot of ground school. Instrument did a little ground school. And they covered the material, but it was very, I don't want to say that it was dry, but it was just, there's a difference between somebody just sort of giving you a bunch of random shit that's not connected with things, and somebody explaining stuff to you in a way that makes it make sense. I do definitely think my ability to absorb and retain things has diminished since I was an undergrad, but I also, because then I could just sit in the class and I could pay attention and I would just have it. And I think I could still to some extent do that, but I think part of it is that those classes were by people who really thought about the stuff and really understood it, versus people who are just like giving you lists of facts and disconnected bits of shit that you have to kind of remember, and a bunch of bullshit like A Tomato Flames. I fucking loathe and despise all these goddamn acronyms. In aviation, I don't know why they have so many of these things. And I do get kind of, it's a way to learn things. And it does, there are certain things like Marvelous VFR 500 or C500. And you're like, okay, so missed approach, and you go through all of the mandatory reporting points. And it's like, yeah, it is kind of useful to some extent, but it also, it's that weird, like, memorizing facts kind of thing versus understanding it and applying it, which was kind of funny because the DPE was talking about all of the, she was framing it as sort of 4 layers of knowledge, and like from having the bits of data all the way through like deep understanding and application. I think I'm very good, generally speaking, at having that sort of conceptual understanding and application. And I think with respect to this stuff, I have quite a bit of confidence that I'm there for instrument. Like if I was flying instrument, I don't feel like I'm not synthesizing those things and actually applying them. I do think I'm a little bit deficient in some of the little bits and bobs and details of the minutia stuff. And then some of it's not just minutia, but a lot of it is like, you know, what is this symbol and where do you find this thing and what are all of these requirements for this, and you know, the things that I don't know. They're not things that are like, they're things that you should know. They're things that are kind of important, but they're also, knowing the details probably doesn't matter that much. Knowing like how, I do think knowing how the air data computer works, or knowing how the pitot-static system works, I think that's important. And the funny thing is I understand these things enough that I could build them. Like if I had to build an airspeed indicator or a altimeter or a rate indicator, I'm pretty sure I could do that. Especially the old steam gauges, and certainly the new electronic ones. And if I wanted to build an IMU, I've done that before. That's, you know, including using Kalman filters for for taking disparate types of information, fusing them together, and then getting that. I've done that stuff. I understand it. And that kind of stuff I get. The things that I was a little bit weak on and that, you know, felt bad about were really like just remembering, like one of them was how many feet per minute is a standard climb gradient. And it's 200 feet per minute is the standard, incidentally. But at the time, and part of it was, I test pretty well, but I don't know what it was. I was just like, you know, you get in that sort of pattern of not feeling good about stuff. And there were a couple of things I was a little bit like, didn't have them at my hands, and just like, eh. And then it was like, I had the 200 something in mind, and I was a little bit over. But the thing is, being a little bit over is actually good because that's conservative. It means that, oh, if you're not able to maintain 200, I think I came up with 220 instead of 200. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but you know, if I would have said like 180, that's a little concerning. If you said the standard was like 300, and if you're not able to maintain 300, you know, it actually would be safer in some sense. So I'm not saying it's a good thing to not know all these details, but I am saying probably didn't matter that much. The ones that I have a deep understanding of a lot of this stuff. I just am missing some of these little fragments, and they're coming together slowly. But I do feel like both of my flight instructors were really just shoveling information in, and it was just not a good way to learn for me. I'm much better at understanding. I'm much better at understanding, I guess, than just having this. And it's one of the things I've always, like calculus. I know people who just have memorized, like, oh, this is how you integrate this, and this is how you... When you understand how integrals and derivatives work, you can do a shit ton with that. If you understand how to derive acceleration from, like position from acceleration and velocity, and how to write differential equations and solve them and this kind of stuff, versus just memorizing like, oh, this is the vertical position of something accelerating under a uniform gravitational field. You can do that and you can memorize that, but it's much better to just understand it. And my abstract algebra teacher said, and actually differential geometry / general relativity, we did a class later on that, but man, just thinking about fiber bundles and things like that, that was a long time ago. But he was explaining in abstract algebra, like, you know, just bring some seeds with you to the test, bring them along with you, and then take those seeds and you plant them and you water them, and you have to know how to grow them. But if you do that, then the seeds will get you to the solution, versus some people would just like memorize the proof, which it's not like, if you just memorize the proof and you change any of the assumptions or you change anything else, you're you're lost. When I was teaching physics and when I was taking physics, there would be people, like, very often they would say, like, you could have a sheet of formulas. And I would struggle to fill up a sheet because, like, there aren't that many formulas to know. And part of the reason is that once you know the formulas and you know how the things work, most of those formulas are just manipulations of things or taking two bits and moving them together. And a lot of them are also just easy to, like uniform acceleration. That's not hard once you get that. And yet I would see people with like microprint, both sides, densely packed formulas and stuff. And then that person would fail the test because they'd look at that and they don't know which to go. They don't even know how to begin solving the problem, especially if they saw the same problem and they worked it through here, found the way to do it and then followed that stuff. They could do it, but if you changed anything on them a little bit, or you asked a question that didn't just require regurgitating exactly what was there, they didn't get it. And that was, that's not a good way to do it. It's similarly, people, I would see people taking notes in class, and they would write down literally everything that was said or that came up on the board or anything like this. They'd write it down and they would do this. And I've tried that a couple of times. And when you do that, you're not paying attention. You're just like furiously writing shit down. And it doesn't mean anything to you because you didn't get it. What I would always do is sort of sit there and pay attention. I did take notes, but the notes were mainly to kind of like, oh, this is a highlight thing, or this is a thing that's, this is the big picture kind of thing. This is the thing that you do need to remember. And the funny thing is I would do that and I never had to look at my notes for the most part. I just, you just do that and then you just have it. And I think one of the things that's nice about that is, for the most part, when I had professors teaching shit, they understood it and they thought about how they presented it. And as opposed to my ex-wife's virology class, like my favorite class as an undergrad was virology. Certainly, I think Dr. Jacobs and then his postdoc at the time, who I think is, I don't know if he's still at ASU, but looked like a mini him version. Like they both had the same beard, and then there was one other guy who was like, okay, he was still pretty good, but Dr. Jacobs was the best one there. And this guy was so good, and the class just was like, I loved it. It was awesome. And my ex-wife took virology, and he was so good that he ended up getting a bunch of grants, and then they basically took him out of the classroom because it was too valuable for the university. Because, why would you want people at the university teaching that are, fuck that. Great fucking system you guys have there. And then they replaced him with somebody who was so bad. Like she was doing, literally, like we had this I think it was called Field's Virology book. It was like bigger than the telephone book that I had for general relativity. Gravitation by, Wheeler, Thorne, and Meisner. And the virology book was like this anthology. It was hardcover. It was very expensive at the time, although now all the books are like that much. I think it was like $100, $150. Most expensive book I had at the time. And it was this giant thing, and it was just like an anthology of different papers on different virus families and different, like things like this. And she literally just like took fucking pages out of that and put them on slides and was putting them up, and she would just like go through the thing, and it was so painful to sit through, and it was tragic to see this subject that's actually kind of interesting and fascinating. And I don't know how anyone could learn anything from her classes versus, like I still remember stuff about Coconut Kadang Kadang, because he's sitting there talking about how, like all of the stuff about how weird the name is and how it was discovered, and that, and painting the picture and letting you understand the context, and it makes a fucking big difference. Anyway, with that, I am going to go for a walk. It is 21:24 So if you send, if you have a time machine and you come back here, then you can bump into me while we're walking. But let's not do that. Let's just avoid that. Yeah. I will probably put this out a little bit out of order. I've got like 2 more banked up already, and I might put this one out on or about Thanksgiving, just because it's going to be called Gratitude. It kind of has the Thanksgiving-y theme. So if they're out of sequence, don't worry about it. Not that it matters that much. As always, thank you, and 再见.